I said in my video from last week that the title Son of God actually had a more specific meaning to it than we give it today. Today we take it to mean the literal Son of God. God had a child here on earth, Jesus. What the Jews understood that to mean at first was a king of the Davidic line. Now, this had been missing since the Jews were in exile in Babylon and had been anxiously awaited, so that when people proclaim, for instance, in the Gospel of Matthew, where this is a specific focus, when people claim that Jesus is the Son of God, at this point, that is all they have in mind. And that's exactly what Paul is picking up on in Romans 1:4, where he says, depending on your translation, that Christ was appointed Messiah, Son of God, by the resurrection, or he was declared. And the reason for that is that there was a time at which he was not the Davidic king. He was the crown prince, as notified by his baptism, when the Spirit descends on him and God says, "This is my Son, with whom I am well pleased." That's to say, he is the crown prince, the intended heir. But he only becomes the heir upon the resurrection, a fact that Paul is quite clear on. But I didn't want this issue to raise any doubts about the biblical account of Christ being divine. I didn't want any doubt cast on that. And so we're going to look at another part of verse 4, as well as verse 7 in Romans 1, that says that Jesus Christ is Lord. Now, what does that term mean? This is another loaded term that unless you know the full story, you're not going to catch all the particulars of it. The name of God is given to Moses in Exodus 3 is Yahweh. Now, in Hebrew, that's a four-letter word. And a little bit of history on the Hebrew language is that the written form of it was only consonantal. At the time that this name was given to Moses, it was a consonantal language because it was an oral culture. So writing things down was merely as a keystone or a memory jogger for the Hebrew telling the story from the Pentateuch. So they had no need for vowels. The consonants were just to remind the storyteller. However, when the Jews went into exile in Babylon, there was a problem of Syrian Aramaic becoming a more prominent language than Hebrew, and the people were losing their recognition of these stories. So along come these guys called the Masoretes. These guys are geniuses because what they do is they create, out of nowhere, a vowel-pointing system that they can just lay on top of this consonantal language as it's written out and produce the exact same story. So they're basically creating this. But while their motivation may have had several parts to it, what they did with the name of God, Yahweh, is they actually overlaid the vowel pointings for the word Adonai and put them over Yahweh. Now, the interesting thing about this is that according to that system, there are more vowels than the consonants call for. And so by their system, it makes the word unreadable as representing the actual sounds. So when you get to that word as a Jewish reader, you actually say Adonai instead of Yahweh, because that's what those vowels represent. So when the Hebrew text gets translated into Greek in the LXX or the Septuagint, it gets translated as kurios. And kurios gets translated from the Greek in the LXX as well as the New Testament into Lord in English. That's where we get the word Lord. So when Paul writes in Romans 1:4 and 1:7 that Jesus is Lord, what he is saying is that Jesus is the God of the Jews, Yahweh. That's what he is saying. It's a profound statement, and it's one that thoroughly pissed off Jews that weren't on board with that yet. But it has another layer of meaning. You see, in Greek, the word kurios, as we translate Lord, was a title reserved for Caesar. So in the Roman world, the only kurios that you would refer to in a majestic sense would have been Caesar. This is also important because the euangelion, the good news, was referring to Caesar. Caesar's victories. Caesar had a son. This would all be good news that was hailed. And so when they talk about the good news, the gospel, the evangelion, from where we get the word evangelize, this is in contrast to the Roman understanding of Caesar, who was worshipped as a god. So not only is Paul claiming that Jesus is the God of the Jews, this is over and against the worship of another God. So there are people who approach faith in general and then bring this to Christianity, but there are people who say that all paths lead to God. While I respect that as a decision for personal belief, that is not what Christianity claims. Christianity makes an exclusive claim. Christ is the way. Christ is the Lord. And that is against anyone else who may claim that title. This is akin to the battle that Elijah has with the prophets of Baal. He lets them call to Baal all day long to light this altar on fire. Nothing happens. He calls on the name of the living God, and the altar lights. If any name called upon was equally worthy of God, then why didn't God answer the prophets of Baal? There were far more of them. They pleaded far longer. Elijah goes and puts water on his altar. His catches on fire. And that's because through and through, the story that Christianity tells is that there is one God. His name is Yahweh. He came to this earth as Jesus, and he wants us to be in a relationship with him, to know him, to follow him. That's the story of Christianity. That's what we've been building to.